Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Um, let's see. Thank you all. We have a few housekeeping items I'll kick it off with, and then we'll um, introduce ourselves and jump right into this project. Thank you all for joining. This is a webinar to talk about the County of Santa Barbara's draft interim greenhouse gas emissions CEQA thresholds of significance. Yes. So a few things. Let me advance the slide here. So this webinar is being recorded and it's also being posted on, it's being broadcast to YouTube right now. So it'll be archived on YouTube and we're separately recording the Zoom video just to have as a backup. So right after the presentation, as soon as the video is ready, I'll upload the link to the project website and make that available. Also, if you are calling in and therefore are not able to see the PowerPoint presentation that I'm sharing, please go to the project website because a PDF copy of the presentation is available there on the project website. That way you can follow along with us here on this Zoom call. We'll keep the PowerPoint presentation slides up on the project website through the duration of this project as well. So if you have a need for them down the road, they will be there. So a few just kind of housekeeping things. We're going to keep this overall to an hour, but there will be at least half that time allotted for questions and answers, open discussions. We're going to kick it off with a presentation from the county and our consultant, Ascent Environmental. During the presentation, we ask that you stay muted just so we can, and try to hold questions until after, but if you have a pressing question, it's fine. Go ahead and use the Q&A feature and type your question in there and we'll be moderating that Q&A feature for questions that pop up. After the presentation, we will be able to unmute you so you can ask questions and you can also still type in questions or email questions as they come up. I'll show you how to do that once we get to the open discussion portion. So my name is Selena Evil Sizer Whitney. I'm a senior planner in the Long Range Planning Division of Santa Barbara County's Planning and Development Department. Also here with me is Alan Bell. He's a supervising planner in the Long Range Planning Division. The county Planning and Development Department hired Ascent Environmental to help us prepare these interim greenhouse gas emission thresholds. So today we have Poonam Boparai, who is a principal with Ascent, and then Brenda Hom is our air quality climate change specialist. They will be presenting along with me and helping answer any questions that come up. So here's a quick overview of how this is all going to happen today. Like I said, county planning and Ascent staff will be giving a presentation. It'll be 25-ish minutes, but you're all currently muted and your video is turned off, so feel free to go ahead and eat lunch while we talk. We'll first talk about what this project is and some background and why we need it, what the goals are. Then we will actually dive into the draft interim thresholds and present those. And then I'll talk about some supporting materials that Ascent is helping us prepare and follow that up by talking about anticipated hearing dates and next steps for this project. Once we get through all that, we'll open it up and have lots of time for questions and discussion. So to dive into the reason we are here today, the County Planning and Development Department, about this time last year, we realized that we were really in need of some more CEQA guidance for relating to greenhouse gas emissions of development plans and projects. And so the purpose of this overall project is to have adopted interim greenhouse gas emissions thresholds that the county can use when reviewing proposed land use projects and plans um, for environmental review purposes. So before I jump into all that, I wanted to just provide a few definitions so that we're all on the same page. First, greenhouse gas emissions. I'm sure all of you have heard the term, and I'm pretty much all of you know what it is, but just so that we're all clear. And for this project, we're primarily talking about carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And we will be talking later about the interim thresholds measuring greenhouse gas emissions in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So later on, you'll see that MTCO2E, and that's what we're talking about. You may wonder what we mean by interim in the context of this project. And what we mean is that these significance thresholds will be in use for approximately 2 years. And I'll get into more on that in a few slides. But that's for the context of this project, that's what we mean by interim. And finally, thresholds of significance. This is in the context of the California Environmental Quality Act. We are establishing these interim thresholds so that the county planners and applicants and CEQA practitioners have an understanding of when a project may cause the emission of so many greenhouse gas emissions that there may be a significant environmental impact as a result of those greenhouse gas emissions. So that's what we're talking about. I'm going to dive into why do we need these interim thresholds? Why did we do this? Basically, it's because the county right now doesn't have any adopted or official or even really unofficial CEQA guidance or coverage for how we as the county should be analyzing greenhouse gas emissions and determining when there might be a significant impact. I'll get into a little bit more later about some related topics. The two topics that feed into this needs discussion are our 2015 Energy and Climate Action Plan, or our ECAP. We've been using it for the past 5 years. We were relying on it to tier off of the ECAP's environmental impact report for CEQA coverage and assisting in CEQA analysis of subsequent development projects. But that 2015 Energy and Climate Action Plan is functionally expired right now, so we can't rely on the ECAP's EIR anymore for tiering purposes. We also don't have an adopted threshold for development projects that are not industrial stationary source projects. So the county does have an adopted threshold for industrial stationary source projects, primarily oil and gas, but we don't have a threshold for any other types of projects.
Selena, sorry to interrupt. There's one question on or asking for clarification on what's meant by tiering off of EIRs.
Yes, if I will definitely answer that. I'm going to hold that question for just a few slides because I have another slide that dives into the Energy and Climate Action Plan and our 2030 Climate Action Plan. So I will definitely answer that, but just hold on for just a couple slides and I'll circle back to it. So let me go to the goals of this project, the goal is to have an adopted interim greenhouse gas emission threshold of significance that will apply to all these other projects that the county permits that are not industrial stationary source projects, but that are subject to discretionary permitting actions, meaning that this greenhouse gas emission threshold of significance will not apply to projects that are exempt from CEQA, and it will not apply to projects that can be permitted by an over-the-counter or a ministerial permit. So it'll only apply to discretionary projects. These interim thresholds will be in place for about 2 years, and then final thresholds will be adopted with the 2030 Climate Action Plan, which I'll talk about in just a little bit more. Just a few more minutes. So here's a little bit of background information on our industrial stationary source threshold. The county has had this threshold in place since 2015. Like I said previously, it applies to industrial stationary source projects, so primarily oil and gas projects, large projects that are subject to discretionary permitting action. And it's a bright line or a mass emissions threshold of 1,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. So the county's had this threshold in place to help planners and CEQA practitioners and applicants understand when industrial stationary source projects when greenhouse gas emissions from industrial stationary source projects might be large enough that it would cause a significant impact. And here's a little bit more on climate action planning efforts that the county has undertaken and will be undertaking that relate to these interim greenhouse gas emission thresholds. So this is where I'll circle back to that previous question. So in 2015, the county adopted our ECAP, our Energy and Climate Action Plan, and it was prepared using a year 2020 emission reduction target. For two reasons. We can't for two reasons that the 2015 ECAP is in effect expired in some senses with regard to using it for CEQA tiering purposes. So since it was prepared using a 2020 emission reduction target, projects that are underway right now can't rely on, they will not fall under the 2015 ECAP because it's already 2015, and projects that are being permitted now wouldn't be in the ground until 2021 at the earliest. When the 2015 ECAP was adopted, the county also adopted an accompanying environmental impact report, or EIR, and both the ECAP and the EIR were prepared in accordance with the state's CEQA guidance that lays out how agencies can and should prepare qualified plans that are intended to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And under the state CEQA guidelines, if an agency prepares a qualified greenhouse gas emission reduction plan and an accompanying environmental impact report, then that emission reduction plan and that EIR can then be used for subsequent development projects. So development projects that come in later on, they, instead of those development projects needing to prepare their own environmental analysis with respect to analyzing greenhouse gas emissions, those development projects can tier off of the ECAP's EIR. So they can, in effect, receive some benefits and some CEQA streamlining. The that's what I mean by tiering. And I'm happy to, whoever asked that question, if you want to email me later, I can send you the specific state CEQA guidance on that topic. The county kicked off a 2030 climate action plan just this past July. So since our 2015 ECAP was written using a year 2020 emissions reduction target, the county is now preparing an updated climate action plan that will use a 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction target. We expect that this 2030 cap will be adopted in 2022, and we expect that any final greenhouse gas significance thresholds will be adopted with the 2030 cap. So these interim thresholds will be in place for a while, and as the 2030 cap proceeds ahead, if the interim thresholds need to be tweaked a bit to coincide with all the actions that will be taken under the 2030 cap, then that will happen, and then final thresholds will be adopted in a couple of years.
Selena, there's one more question for you.
Okay.
Does the industrial stationary source threshold apply to wastewater treatment plants and landfills, as well as oil and gas?
That is a good question. I honestly don't know right off the top of my head. I know it applies to mining projects and renewable energy projects. But Jody, I can definitely find out the answer and let you know for sure. So I will get back to you on that. Okay, so that's all the background information. I'm happy to dig into any more of it if you have questions later on. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Ascent now, and they will actually talk about the recommended interim thresholds.
Great, thank you, Selena. So yes, as Selena mentioned, we're going to talk about the process to come up with the recommended interim thresholds for non-industrial stationary source projects. So for the way this differs from the industrial threshold is that the county is proposing a two-tier framework for non-industrial projects. So as Selena mentioned earlier, these thresholds would apply to all non-exempt discretionary CEQA projects processed by the county. The first year threshold is a concept that should be familiar to a lot of you. It's the mass emission screening level. So it's similar to the application of the industrial threshold, which is set at 1,000 metric tons CO2 equivalent, as Selena mentioned. And beyond that, the way this framework differs is that the mass emissions level is being treated as a first step screening threshold. So if a project exceeds that first tier, then it would be evaluated under a second tier efficiency threshold, which is expressed in terms of metric tons per service population, which I will cover here in a minute. If you could go to the next slide, Selena. So the tier 1 threshold was developed using a process that's based on emissions capture, which again, if any of you were involved in the county's industrial stationary source threshold development, it's the same concept. It's geared towards capturing a meaningful amount of emissions from new development projects so as to not impede the county's achievement of its greenhouse gas targets. This process was also used by air districts such as the Bay Area Air Quality Management District for the very first quantitative greenhouse gas thresholds in the state. So we've kept the same framework and customized it to Santa Barbara data for unincorporated county. So I'll briefly cover this, and I'm happy to discuss further during Q&A. But we started with a review of historical permits processed by the county over the last 10 years. So we wanted to capture a data set that was large enough so it is representative of the types of permits the county sees, and can also account for any ups and downs due to changes in economic conditions. So if there's a number of permits are spiking or drastically dropping, then we can typically associate that with changes in the economy. Um, this data set was a pretty heavy lift for county staff. It yielded over 7,000 entries, and they did all the work in helping pull that together. And over half of those were discretionary projects, but including CEQA exemptions. So we took that data set and filtered it to include these discretionary projects. And we assigned emissions values to those filtered projects, either based on information available through their CEQA documents publicly, or through modeling where this information was missing based on the project description. We started with a working assumption that this average rate of permit processing would continue to be similar into the future. We followed an iterative process to set a threshold level and determine a capture rate for emissions. So, for example, in the county's case right now, the screening level proposed is 300 metric tons, and that would capture 87% of emissions from new development, which means that 87% of future emissions from new development would then be subject to a tier 2 analysis, and the remaining would be considered to have a less than significant impact. The capture rate itself is also cross-checked against the county's 2030 greenhouse gas target. So we are performing that additional check to confirm that setting a threshold at this level would not impede the county's ability to meet its stringent target of 50% below 2007 levels by 2030. Based on preliminary information on the target and growth data, and understanding that the 2030 climate action plan analysis is still to be performed, we have derived some estimates of reductions needed from new development based on processing the data that we have available. So a screening level set at 300 metric tons would allow the county to achieve adequate reductions from new development while also capturing a meaningful amount of emissions to analyze against tier 2 and then further mitigate if they exceed tier 2. As I mentioned, the caveat here is that the 2030 climate action plan could require higher reductions of new development based on the county's permitting authority. Because that analysis is not done, we have tended to be very conservative in our assumptions in this analysis. But with the understanding that if the county chooses to retain this framework once the climate action plan is done, that this analysis would need to be revisited to better align it with the final climate action plan. Next slide, please, Selena. So aligning with this 300 metric tons, we came up with size-based screening criteria for different project types. So as you can see, it corresponds to 34 single-family dwelling units, certain levels of commercial, shopping, office type of uses. So if you have a project that is submitted to the county that fits any of these and is below these screening criteria, then it can be presumed to have a less than significant impact. If a project doesn't necessarily fit in here, if it has a certain mix of uses, or maybe it's a use that's not quite captured and is more unique, then the project would need to provide estimated greenhouse gas emissions to determine if it is below the 300 metric tons. Next slide, please. The next concept for the second tier is expressed as an efficiency threshold. So it's intended to evaluate how efficient a project would be in accommodating increases in greenhouse gas emissions. So it takes that concept of a mass emissions threshold a step further and really starts to look at how a project is designed and what mix of uses it is proposing. So this is also benchmarked to the county's 2030 target, the 50% below 2007 levels by 2030, and an estimated amount of emissions from new development, along with growth in population and jobs. This is a concept that has been used across the state, but we are using local data here to benchmark it again to county conditions. And I'll show the framework on the next slide. This is an analogy I like to use because we've been using this concept in different contexts before. So I like to think of it as a water well that has a limit of 100 gallons per day of drawdown. And if you have 20 residents that rely on that well, then if you divide the 100 by 20, then you have a limit of 5 gallons per capita per day that can be drawn by each resident. So we essentially take that concept and apply it to greenhouse gas emissions. We have an idea of what the allowable emissions in 2030 are for the county based on the target. We also know what the population and employment will be based on the demographics data available. And so when you divide that X emissions target by Y population plus employment, that's what you get as your efficiency metric. So in the past, this metric has had some concerns related to using state data. So again, that's why we are using local Santa Barbara unincorporated county specific data to derive this threshold. Next slide, please, Selena. So this essentially the next two slides show this framework in a flowchart mode. So again, you start with determining if your project is CEQA exempt. If it is, then it is presumed to have a less than significant impact. If it is not, then you either estimate the project's operational emissions or you compare it against those size-based screening criteria. And then if your emissions are determined to be less than 300 metric tons, then again, you can conclude a less than significant impact. If it does not, then we go to the next slide, um, which is where you apply the tier two, the 3.8 metric tons per service population. And this is benchmarked again to 2030. So if you compare your project's emissions to this level and it is below that metric tons per service population, again, you can conclude a less than significant impact related to greenhouse gas emissions. If it's not, then the project would need to propose mitigation measures to the extent feasible to try to achieve this level. And if after application of mitigation, you still have emissions that exceed that level, then the project would be considered to have a significant impact with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide. So in addition to the threshold framework itself, we have developed those size-based screening tables that you all saw earlier. We're also developing a list of potential mitigation measures for the county, along with their applicability to different project types. So this list will be maintained by the county and updated as needed as new information and technology become available and potentially rolled into the climate action plan as that analysis proceeds. We're also, based on these technical analyses, going to be updating the county environmental thresholds and guidelines manual, the greenhouse gas emissions section there to incorporate these land use based interim greenhouse gas thresholds along with the industrial stationary thresholds that are already included in there. And I believe I handed back to Selena there.
Yes, thanks, Poonam. We have 3 questions received on the Q&A, and the first 2 I will hold just for a few minutes because they're a little bit more in depth. But the most recent one, it asks, how does the service population efficiency metric work for projects that have customers driving the emissions, like hotels or golf courses?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that is one of the limitations of this threshold type is it works really well for residential, office uses, um, to some extent retail as well. Mixed use projects, it works really well because it allows you to actually look at the efficacy of having a mix of uses on site. It is challenging for the types of uses that are mentioned in the comment, and also things like uses like schools, religious institutions where you have visitor-based traffic. So I think if the county does see those types of projects come through, the applicability of the threshold would need to be evaluated. I don't have a perfect answer for that, but we are thinking about that question, and we will try to provide some guidance on how to come up with the service population and how maybe some of these other types of users may be able to use this framework.
Great, thanks, Poonam. So I wanted to let you all know of some upcoming hearings. So the final deliverable, yeah, I guess it is the final deliverable that Poonam just mentioned on the previous slide, is that Ascent is helping the planning department update the greenhouse gas emissions section of our county environmental thresholds and guidelines manual. So the planning department is anticipating taking that updated county environmental thresholds and guidelines manual, along with these recommended interim thresholds, to the County Planning Commission next month. We're aiming for October 14th. And then after that, we're aiming to get everything to the County Board of Supervisors by the end of this calendar year. So right now we're hoping to get to their December 15th hearing. Um, Staff reports for hearings are posted on the respective hearing webpage about a week before each hearing. So if you are interested, you could always email me or check the hearing website for the staff reports when they're released. And here's a few more ways to stay involved. We really, really appreciate that you are here today. The project website on the county's long range planning division webpage will be updated regularly. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I'll post this presentation there, plus the memorandums we'll be receiving from Ascent on their work, um, compiling all this information and data and analyzing things and making their recommendations. I'll also be posting information on the hearings when we get to that point, so you can go access the staff reports through the project website for those upcoming hearings. You can also register for project updates, so we'll send out emails in the future about when the hearing dates are finalized and any important information, so you can register so you'll get email notification. And also, please just call or email me if you have any questions after this presentation. So we're going to conclude the presentation part and kick off with the questions open discussion part. We've got a solid 25 minutes until 1 o'clock. So things can, as I'm sure most of you know, things can get chaotic on Zoom pretty easily. So the way we're going to organize this is if you have a microphone and you are using Zoom and you want to ask your question, please click the raise hand icon, and then I will see that your hand is raised and I'll unmute you, and then you'll have an opportunity to talk, ask questions of us. If you don't have a microphone, please continue to use the Q&A feature to type your questions and comments in. And if you are calling in by phone, then if you want to email me, I will open up my email right here. My email is SELEVILSIZOR at countyofsb.org. Or you could probably just Google like Salina, Santa Barbara County Planning. I'm the only one and find me. So I saw several questions came in. There were 2 previously, so we'll just get started and answer questions and talk. There were 2 questions that came in during the presentation, so I'll start with those. The first one asked, can you share more about the emissions targets and how they have changed? What was the 2020 target? What is the 2030 target? Has the projected rate of greenhouse gas reduction changed? Yes, I can share more about that. So the 2030 target that the board established was a goal to reduce emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in the unincorporated county areas. So those areas that the county as an entity has jurisdiction over. The goal was reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 15% based on what the emissions were in 2007. So 2007 is our baseline year. The 2030 target is to reduce emissions by 50% by the year 2030, still using the year 2007 as a baseline. Um, if you have any more questions about that, feel free to let me know. I can share more information about that. Another question that came in is how many projects have been permitted and are operating that exceeded the 2015 threshold? So meaning the industrial stationary source threshold. What were the largest ones and how did they mitigate emissions? This information we didn't analyze as part of this project that we're talking about today because we already, since we already have this threshold that applies to industrial stationary source projects, we completely excluded projects that are that do um, have industrial stationary sources of emissions from the analysis and data collection as part of this project because those projects won't be subject to this interim threshold. So I don't have an answer for you now, but I can dig around and ask our energy division to see if they have a good handle on how many projects in the past 5 years have been subject to that threshold and have exceeded that threshold and have more information. So, Michael, I can get back to you on that. Okay, let me see. I see two more. Why don't we, let's see, let me see if any hands are raised. Um, okay, I don't see any hands raised right now. So we'll go back to the Q&A questions. As the emissions thresholds for stationary sources were based on the initial 2020 emissions targets, are stationary source thresholds being updated in line with the new targets as well? At this point in time, the stationary source threshold is not being updated. Um, I don't know if there are plans to update it in the near future or not, but at this point in time, it's not being updated. Only um, a threshold for projects that are not stationary source.
Selena, can I clarify that targets are related to total emissions that we included in our inventory, which excluded stationary sources?
Right. Thanks, Brenda. And then we have another question. Where is the list of potential mitigation measures? So the list is, it's not, so it will be made public. It's not going to be an official list of required measures that will be adopted with the thresholds. We intend for it to be more of a living document where it'll be a resource that CEQA practitioners, applicants, planners can use when a project does exceed this interim threshold. Then we can give them this list and say, here are some potential mitigation measures that may apply to your project. Would be a good starting point for you. And then mitigation measures, they can select any from that list that apply, tweak them as necessary to apply to that specific project. So we don't have a list right now. We're still developing it, but we will definitely make it available to the public once it's ready. See here. Okay, another question. For the screening table, and particularly the warehouse land uses, did you account for the fact that these uses often have proposed combustion equipment, such as larger water heaters, boilers, emergency engines, may not be appropriate to automatically screen out a warehouse based on square feet if project-specific equipment are proposed?
I can help answer that. Yeah, so we modeled warehouses using the modeling tools that are typically used for land use projects, so CaliMod. And if a project does include any process emissions that are not captured by the land use attributes for the project, then that should be added. So the screening level should not or would not automatically apply. And we do have caveats for those types of situations where it doesn't. quite fit within the definition of the land use that's been analyzed as part of the screening table.
Great. I don't see any hands raised, but definitely if you want to talk to us, raise your hand and we will let you talk. We are also available after this presentation. If you have any follow-up questions, like I mentioned, please feel free to email me or call me. Otherwise, oh, there's another question. Oh, thanks, Dan. I know this is a pretty technical topic. It can get technical, very quickly. So if you do want any more technical information, that you really want to dive into the weeds on something, then let me know and I can provide that information. Okay, I guess we'll just thank you. If you have any other questions, we'll just hang out one more minute. But otherwise, thank you all very much for giving up your lunch to listen to this. And you will be hearing more from us in the future with regard to this topic and also as the 2030 Climate Action Plan proceeds ahead. So there will be a lot going on, a lot of exciting things going on in the future. Cool. I think that's it. Thank you all very much again. And once again, for the 5th time, let me know if you have any questions. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.